All right, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let us begin our webinar. Thanks for holding on for a few minutes. I want to make sure I'm audible. If someone would give me a thumbs up in the chat room or say you can hear me, that would be great. I want to make sure I'm audible. Awesome, I see thumbs up. Thank you, Kyra, Rebecca Squires. I've learned through working in Zoom and WebEx, I say all the smartest things while I'm mute. That's what I learned. At any rate, good afternoon. My name is Matt McCarter. I'm the Grants Branch Chief at the Idaho Office of Emergency Management. And I'm in my office here to conduct this informational session with my colleague, Angela Toomey. She is the Finance Section Chief here at the Idaho Office of Emergency Management. And I'm going to toggle and try to share my screen and walk through a slide deck for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program Bidders Workshop. And this workshop is an opportunity for you as individuals who represent or work with or are partners with nonprofit organizations. And if by the end of our time together, you come to the conclusion that this is a great opportunity for you, great, that's our purpose. If we come to the end and you realize it's not a good fit, that's great too. And that is our purpose as well, because this is a fit. Any grant is a good fit for some organizations, not for others. So the goal here is to really paint a picture and lay out the landscape for this great funding opportunity for Idaho nonprofits to increase preparedness against terrorist attacks and hazards. So it's a great opportunity for Idaho, and my interest is to spread the word as far as wide as we can to make sure Idaho is best prepared. And so that's our goal today. Here's what I'd like to do. I have a slide deck that I'd like to walk through, and as there are questions that come up along the way, here's what I'd encourage you to do. Don't wait till the end to ask your question. Go ahead and type it into the chat box. And what I'll do is pause from time to time and have Angela read the question, and we'll do our best to address the question at the time. If we don't know the answer today, we'll certainly circle back and respond. I'm recording this webinar, and it'll be posted on our website. And I'll navigate to that here in a minute to show you some items on the website that may be of interest to you, and that will help you with this grant application. So with that, to make sure everybody is in the right meeting room, that's our goal today. And I'm going to attempt to share the right screen. If you'd stand by. And Angela, do you see the PowerPoint? Perfect. All right. So, and for those of you who joined a little late, if you would include your name and the nonprofit organization you represent or work with or partner with in the chat box, that would be great for our information. And with that, what we'll do is, as the days and the weeks carry on, if there's questions that come up and we have answers to frequently asked questions, we'll go ahead and publish those. And we want to make sure we get those to the entirety of the group. So, Nonprofit Security Grant Program, FY21 Bidders Workshop. So what I'd like to do is paint a picture of what is this. So you'll see some acronyms, and I'll do my best to temper those and spell them out. NSGP is the grant program we're talking about. This is a competitive grant program intended to provide federal funding for physical security enhancements and other security-related activities to nonprofits that are at risk of a terrorist attack. And that last thing, that definition of risk of a terrorist attack, is pretty broad and wide. And so don't let that be restrictive at this point for your perspective. And the goal of this, working with FEMA, is really to integrate preparedness activities of nonprofit organizations with a broader state and local preparedness efforts. And this is really a set of a comprehensive milieu of measures administered by FEMA and Homeland Security to strengthen communities against a terrorist attack. So this is the big broad umbrella under which NSGP resides. So something I'm going to highlight up front, because if you've read the NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, there's a differentiation, and this is important if you move forward with an application. There are two buckets in the NSGP program. One is NSGP-S, and that stands for state. And the other is NSGP-UA, and UA stands for urban area. And what FEMA does is analyze population centers, concentrations of populations, and they prioritize funding to help protect those populous areas. Idaho has no designated urban areas. Therefore, every application from Idaho should be NSGP-S, and that just stands for state. If you apply for UA, your application will be jettisoned by FEMA because nobody in Idaho is applicable because we don't have the population centers. So today we're talking about NSGP-S. And the period of performance, in other words, the grant window within which to do the grant activity is 36 months. And the frame is September 1 through August 31. And I highlight this to encourage you to consider what it is you'd like to get done in terms of training, planning, target hardening, and the amount of time it'll take, and the window within which we're able to do it. So it's a good span of 36 months, but the application does request you map out milestones and timeframes. So what I'd like to do initially, and I've had a lot of questions about this, is touch on eligibility. And eligibility is determined by IRS designation. So 501c3 entities are the only entities that are eligible for this grant opportunity. So here's some examples: churches, mosques, synagogues. They're considered exempt if they meet the requirements of the section and do not have to apply to receive recognition of exemption from the IRS. Eligibility also hinges on the ability to demonstrate through the application that the organization is at high risk of a terrorist attack. And again, pretty broad reading there. We can talk more about that. And there's a word here that may be new to you. It was new to me. I'm about 3.5, 4 months into this job. And the word investment justification, that's literally the grant application. And we'll walk through it today. It's an Excel worksheet that has 7 different sections, and FEMA calls it the investment justification, synonymous with the grant application. It's the same thing. If you're not sure about your organization or a partner organization, the IRS has a great search engine that I've used a couple times, and it's a tax-exempt organization search, and it's on irs.gov. And again, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website, and I will also post the slide deck so you can click on the active links if that's helpful. So we touched on eligibility. Organizations ineligible under the NSGP. Here's some examples that are called out in the NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity. Utilities, for-profit transport companies, and organizations active in politics, lobbying, and advocacy work. And there's some examples for you. And the last bullet is labor, agricultural, or horticultural organizations. And there's some examples. And I think that's the first time I've ever seen the word flower societies. At any rate, they are ineligible. So eligibility, ineligibility. Is there any questions so far? Great, we're going to clip along. There are some resources to help round out and understand the NSGP as the NSGP seeks to integrate the preparedness activities of nonprofit organizations with broader state and local preparedness efforts. And so again, integration in terms of alignment around how do we best prepare and prevent catastrophic events from occurring. To understand the national preparedness goal, and you needn't deep dive into this, it's more for awareness. At any rate, the national preparedness goal is listed under this website. In terms of Idaho, what's happening in the state, the Office of Emergency Management has a community preparedness page with some nice language on it. And if I could, again, ask all to make sure your microphones are on mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. And here's some other helpful information. The FY 2021 NSGP NOFO, again, Notice of Funding Opportunity, is located on that first link. There is a good bit of guidance, and it's not thick reading, but it's very helpful to understand the goal of the program. There are some prompts in the grant application or investment justification form that calls out what mission areas or core capabilities might your project address or touch on. And to understand what those are, this website will take you right to it. They're very straightforward. And then of all the ancillary documents I've looked at on the FEMA website, The frequently asked questions document is linked here, the last link right here. Very helpful. 2 pages, I think. Does a nice job of painting the picture as to whether or not this is a good opportunity for you right now, or maybe put a pin in it, come back next year. So in terms of the funding landscape, here's what we're looking at. Idaho, and we're determined as a recipient because we applied directly to FEMA for dollars. Idaho has been allocated 1.35 million for this particular program in FY21, and that's an increase nationally of 50 million. And so with that, you can see an increased emphasis from the White House and Congress on how important this function is to make sure our nonprofit organizations and communities are protected. In terms of applicants, which would be described as those of you on the phone, an interested nonprofit, and that's identified as a subrecipient. So the State Office of Emergency Management is designated as the recipient. A subrecipient would be an applicant, a nonprofit with interest. So applicants may, or sub-applicants, subrecipients rather, can apply for up to 150,000 per site, and a nonprofit can apply up to 3 sites for a total of 450,000, depending on how many sites are vulnerable and of interest. So that's the landscape. States had the opportunity to decrease the cap on that 150. Idaho chose not to. I can tell you, in the past, interest applications for this program haven't been as robust as would be ideal. And so it hasn't been very competitive. And so we didn't see the need to decrease that funding level per site. And here's a note to call out. I mentioned investment justification, the grant application. Those, if there's multiple sites under one nonprofit, an investment justification is required for each unique site. So a separate one is required for each. In terms of the phases of review, applications are submitted to the SAA, and the SAA stands for the State Administrative Agency. So from FEMA's perspective, the Idaho Office of Emergency Management, which is that acronym, IOEM, IOEM is the State Administrative Agency, SAA. So interested subrecipients or applicants submit applications to the SAA. What happens at the SAA or IOEM, we undergo a review process, and what we'll do is gauge the applications for eligibility, and then from a state perspective, we'll rank order them. And we'll have a slate, say 1 to 10, 1 to 15, 1 to 5 in order. And then that is submitted to FEMA for a federal review. And they'll do their technical review. And then it's forwarded to the Secretary of Homeland Security for funding decisions. So that's the process and the funding landscape. To get into some nuts and bolts in terms of what's allowable or what are the things these dollars can afford you to do, what are acceptable costs and activities, I'd like to highlight some to give you a concrete idea of what we're talking about. Planning is an allowable cost, to be sure. Security or emergency planning expenses and the materials required to conduct planning activities. So here's some parameters. Must relate to the protection of the facility and the people within the organization and should include consideration of individuals with access and functional needs, as well as those with limited English proficiency. A lot of this grant I've noticed as I learn about it is very site-based. It's about facilities, structure, brick and mortar. Examples of planning activity include, but aren't limited to, the development or enhancement of security plans. There's great expertise in our state that can help prepare you and equip you to either update or establish a security plan. Emergency contingency or continuity of operations plan, evacuation shelter-in-place plans, and emergency response plans. So some examples of planning allowable costs. Training and exercise is also an allowable cost, and that is limited to an organization's security personnel, staff, members, and volunteers only. Sitting on a number of technical assistance webinars about this grant from FEMA, one of the things that was emphasized is this grant often gets people thinking about equipment and cameras and film for the windows and access control, and all that's very helpful. and may well be the greatest need. But that's not to underemphasize or deny the importance of planning, training, and exercise. That's really important when talking about safety and security. And training costs are limited to attendance fees and related expenses, material supplies, and equipment. And a fine point here, travel is not a reimbursable cost for training under the NSGP. Here's some examples of training and exercise: physical and cybersecurity, target hardening and terrorism awareness, employee preparedness topics such as community emergency response team training, active shooter, and emergency first aid. One thing that I'm reading a lot about nationally and locally is the need to shore up our cybersecurity profile from an organization-specific perspective and a statewide perspective. And so this is an area to close some gaps in the cybersecurity space. Applicants should include specific details about any proposed training and exercise, including topic, attendees, participants, length, what vulnerability the activity will help mitigate. And on that, if you have wonderings or questions, or you know there's a deficiency in your organization, but not sure where to go to close the gap in terms of training, that would be a good opportunity to give my office a call. I know some things, my colleagues in this space know a lot more than I, and I know how to talk to them. So if there are any questions around closing a gap and you're not sure what source to go to, certainly feel free to call. Equipment is absolutely an NSGP allowable costs. The way that FEMA frames funding supports in terms of allowability for equipment is through what is called the AEL, and that's an acronym for the Authorized Equipment Lists. The AEL is bucketed into categories for different flavors of equipment to help with safety, security, and preparedness. And in terms of NSGP, categories 14 and 15 are the only allowable categories to pull from. Oh, sure. There's a question from Yvonne. Thanks for the question. And I will post this PowerPoint and a recording of the presentation on the website that I will show you within this presentation, but it's on the Idaho Office of Emergency Management website. So yes, the answer is yes. This slide deck does have a link right here to the AEL, and that will show you all the categories, specifically 14 and 15. And here are some highlights or examples of what resides in categories 14 and 15. So you get a sense of the flavor: access control, surveillance equipment, impact resistant doors and gates, intrusion detection, lighting, physical perimeter security, screening and inspection, and backup computer hardware, operating system, data storage, and application software. So those are some examples of allowable costs for equipment. Again, the link to the AEL is there. You can peruse at your leisure. There are two pieces of equipment that are allowed that reside outside categories 14 and 15, and they include handheld radios and public warning systems. There's a note on the public warning system, and that's an area of interest, and that can close a gap for your organization. It's important to attend to accessibility, those hard of hearing, for instance. So an item of consideration, but I did want to call these out because they reside outside categories 14 and 15. Would that include? Oh, good. Would that include a satellite phone? That's a great question. That's something I'd be remiss to definitively answer right now, but that's something we'll jot down and certainly get back to you on. Great question. And here's another note, and this applies to all FEMA grants, and it belongs, I think, in the equipment section, because anytime we're thinking about installing something, including something, moving dirt outside, doing any change to a structure, there is a process called environmental planning and historic preservation that needs to occur to ensure we adhere to national environmental protection laws and rules, in addition to historic preservation. So we support local entities and jurisdictions with this process all the time. We have experts on it, but there's the link for it. And depending on what you want to do, it may call in the requirement for an EHP review. It may not. It just depends on what specific activity you have in mind. Additional allowable costs include personnel. Contracted security protection is the only allowable cost in this category under NSGP. And here's some rationale. These dollars are time limited, as I mentioned, 36 months. And to hire an FTE or part-time FTE for a limited time isn't going to get us the long-term protection we're looking for. The reason why contracted security is included here is there are examples of special events, holy days, areas of heightened risk for specific organizations where it would be applicable to have extra security protection. And that may apply to an organization on the phone today. If I can I remind the group to mute your mic? Just make sure your mic is muted before we move on, so there's no distractions. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you. Funds may not be used to purchase equipment for contracted security, and justification of proposed contracted security personnel spending and the target hardening narrative of the section of the application. So, in other words, if this is an area that is important to you, that you want to explore, some justification is required as it relates to the goal of the grant in the narrative section. So here's some details of what might be asked for. Okay. I have you in caller 5. If that's you, can you please mute your phone? All right, stand by. We're going to try it. There you go. Well, I can mute it on my end. Yep. Thank you, Angela. So that has to do with personnel. Moving on. M&A costs are certainly allowable, and this is up to 5% of the award. And this is really work that's required to manage the grants. Things like reporting, financial management, correspondence and monitoring, meetings. So if this is something you write in your budget, there's a justification that's requested. And really, this is not to support the day-to-day operational costs of the organization. It's really to support those additional activities that are required as a result of accepting an award. So no M&A costs are eligible up to 5%. And to give you an example of unallowable costs, and this is not an exhaustive list, here's some things that are off the table in terms of the NSGP. Again, I mentioned operational costs, public safety personnel. Again, one time for contracted makes sense for this grant. Long-term does not because it's time limited. General use expenditures, overtime, development of risk and vulnerability assessments, license plate readers, facial recognition, Knox boxes, weapons or guns, landscaping, initiative that enhance federal property, initiatives about technology development, proof of concept, pre-award costs. And this is something else. I'll pause on pre-award costs because this is a misstep that happens sometimes. And that is, and work is done on an application, vulnerability assessment, and a grantee seeks to pay back or recoup those costs. And those costs occurred pre-award, before the award was made. Those are unallowable. And so no going in, that any costs incurred prior to award is not eligible for reimbursement or payment through this grant, or most grants I've worked with. Moving on, sexual predatory screening database, development of the investment justification, or weapons training. So to give you a sense of what's off the table, this is the point of the slide. So we've reviewed the overview, the timeline, the dollars on the table, some allowable activities, some unallowable equipment expenditures. And then in terms of review, hold on a second. In terms of review, we'll go into what FEMA looks for and then what the state gets into as well. And it looks like we have a question. Go ahead, Angela.
Yvonne had another question. So hiring someone to do a security assessment.
That's a great question. So the question is, hiring someone to do a security assessment is not allowed. Here are the high points of the grant, and that is to have a sense of your vulnerabilities through a security assessment, an assessment of some kind. so you know the greatest weak points to include in your application. And so hiring someone to do a security assessment post-award would be, that would be after the fact. You'd want to have a sense of what your assessment is prior to application. And I'm going to talk more about that, but that wouldn't be the central point of this funding opportunity. Yeah. Thank you, Yvonne. Great question. So FEMA review priorities. Here's what FEMA calls out and will look for in terms of your application. And by the way, these are literally the elements of the application I'm sharing with you. A mission statement, and what FEMA is attempting to do, and for the state, there's interest as well, is what is the nature or categorization of the nonprofit or facilities, faith-based, education, medical, or other. And so part of the application is including a mission statement. So we in FEMA get a real clear sense of what it is you're trying to change or move to assert positive change. And the mission statement should be documented on official letterhead. And that's also called out in this presentation later. Now, a vulnerability assessment is required as part of the application. And that can be a scary word, and it can imply a really big lift. There are consultants who cost thousands who take months to do a vulnerability assessment in a big facility. However, for this grant opportunity, there are no specific criteria FEMA calls out for what the vulnerability assessment needs to include. There's no requirement in terms of length, depth, breadth. That said, it should be something meaningful and should point you to where is your greatest gap in terms of hardening and protection. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I don't want that to be overwhelming or intimidating, because there's ways to do it in a succinct, efficient manner. And the completed investment justification. And again, it's basically an Excel worksheet. I'll show you it here today. If it's a site that is proposed, it must be a physical address, no PO box numbers. And as I mentioned before, one site and one address addressed per investment justification. And here's a fine point. The organization must occupy the site at the time of the application. And so if you're looking at moving into a facility or a site that may need some help in this area, perhaps wait till next year, but the organization must occupy the site at the time of the application. And any supporting documentation as well can be included. And not required, but the supporting documentation would speak to any threats to the facility, if applicable, police reports, insurance reports, pictures, any documentation that demonstrates, hey, we have been targeted or we're likely to be targeted for whatever reason. So supporting documentation is not required, certainly encouraged. So these the top three bullets you see here, this comprises the grant application: a mission statement on letterhead, a vulnerability assessment, and a completed investment justification. Optional, supporting documentation. Keeping in mind this is a competition, so if that's at your fingertips, or you can comprise some documentation supporting your case, that's great. Moving on, FEMA review priorities. Why does FEMA care about the mission statement? Again, it helps us identify the who, what, and why of the organization and the purpose of the organization, and any element of the mission statement that may elevate risk for the organization. FEMA looks at the vulnerability assessment, and the VA is really the foundation of the IJ. In other words, your assessment should identify those areas of greatest risk, which should drive your funding and your milestones. And the VA should address threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences of potential events at a site or a location. Any equipment or activity should directly link or relate to the threats and vulnerabilities that are called out in the vulnerability assessment. And I mentioned this before, there are no specific requirements for the vulnerability assessments. Applicants are encouraged to engage someone with a security, law enforcement, military, or emergency service background to conduct the VA. Let's see, is it on this slide? Yeah. So on this one, I want to pause for a moment. Again, the vulnerability assessment can be intimidating if there is someone on your board. If you are friends with the chief of police, or every county in the state of Idaho has an emergency manager. So there's expertise around the state regarding vulnerability assessments. And there's a lot of different models as well. This one was provided by FEMA, and it's example for houses of worship. As I reviewed it, it appears to me to be applicable to almost any organization. And I want to pull it up so you can get a sense of what we're talking about here. So there's a user guide and there's a self-assessment survey. So this is a great example of something you can do in-house. If you have anybody with military, emergency management, law enforcement background, even better, because neutral outside eyes with some expertise in this area will serve you well. So it gives you a sense of what's the question, and then you self-assess or have someone or a team assess. It talks about, do you have a security manager or committee to make security decisions? And then it gives you a range. Is there a written security safety emergency operation plan? High or low? Are employees or volunteers trained on a security safety operation plan? So you can see it's pretty straightforward. Are the congregants or your patients or constituents, whoever it is that you serve, are they trained on the elements of the safety and security plan? Are there placards on the wall for evacuation, so forth? As a house of worship or organization coordinated security safety with first responders. So you get a sense of, it can be pretty straightforward to self-assess or have someone with those particular backgrounds self-assess for you. So this, I thought, was a great example of how to make it doable, easy, not as big a lift as we might think. And again, that's one example. There are myriad examples. Some are more specific to service-oriented organizations. Others are more specific to bricks and mortar, and others are more specific to cyber. So depending on where you see your greatest threat, you may want to dig in on those certain areas. So moving on with the review process, investment justification. This is really the meat and potatoes of an application. It describes the who, what, when, where, and why, and how of the plan to harden targets. There are 7 sections. It is required to use the MS Excel fillable form. I'll show you here in a minute. Submissions in any other format will not be allowed. And again, whatever you propose in terms of money, activity, milestones, it should line up with the findings of your vulnerability assessment and address the target hardening initiatives that will mitigate the identified vulnerabilities. The IJ also establishes timelines and milestone for the completion of the investments, identifies the key players that will be involved. So I want to highlight this. The way an application is submitted for this grant opportunity is through an email address I'm going to give you here in a minute. And in terms of the file submission naming convention, in terms of the investment justification, here's an easy way to do it. Name the organization, FY21 NSGP, IJ. Same thing with the vulnerability assessment. And then the mission statement on your letterhead is NSGP MS. And then supporting documentation can just be name of org, supporting docs. Pretty straightforward. But if folks can stick to this convention, it will make our job organizing applications a little easier. So at this point, let me see what's next here. At this point, I want to take us to the Idaho Office of Emergency Management website. So here's the main page of IOEM. And to get to where we need to go for the NSGP, we go to the grants section. And there, it's interesting, there are 2 flavors of grants in terms of emergency management that come from FEMA. One bucket is called non-disaster grants, and those are about preparedness. The other is disaster recovery, and those are about after a fire, a flood, a pandemic, mitigation activity. This is kind of during and after the fact. This is before the fact. NSGP is a non-disaster grant. So if you scroll down and find NSGP on our website, you'll see some brief information. This is a memo that I distributed with an email that hopefully you received to join us here today. This is the application. Now, in terms of the application, the file, and I've mentioned this to FEMA, and they're aware, this form comes from FEMA. There are some areas of this that might take a minute or two to populate, i.e. nonprofit exemption. Sometimes for me, it took a couple clicks, and then a yes/no option will come down. Sometimes I wonder if it's pulled from a different web browser. That may determine whether or not how well it works for you, but it's not the cleanest in the world in terms of its clunkiness, but it does work. It took me a little bit of fiddling to get to work. So I just ask for your patience with this. And I'd say if it's not working in one area, try downloading it with another web browser. So this is the Excel spreadsheet. This is the required format. There are text character limitations in some of these boxes, these various character, and that's really so FEMA doesn't have to read a novel. It sounds like they get a little overwhelmed by the voluminous applications that come in sometimes. At any rate, so it's limited, so you want to be succinct and to the point. And you can see here it calls out the following: the legal name, the physical address of the facility, what county the facility resides in, year of construction, and what's the type of the organization, ideology, beliefs, and mission. A little bit about the membership and community served. And again, you need not write a novel here, just give the reviewers a sense of the flavor of your organization. Tax exempt, yes or no. The Dun & Bradstreet number. If you're tax exempt, I'm assuming you have one of these. Dun & Bradstreet can take some time to establish. If you don't have one of these, it is a bit of a process, and there's a lot of information online about how to get this done. If you're in a place where you need to establish a Dun & Bradstreet number, certainly reach out to my office. I can help point you the right direction. And really, Dun & Bradstreet is about two things. The Dun is about IRS tax status and review, and Bradstreet that has to do with the feds and tracking grant funds. So there's two different functions. One's tax and one's federal tracking. Next area is the Urban Area Security Initiative. Now, this is the one you want to make sure and say, no, not applicable, because if you click Urban Security Initiative, your application will be jettisoned because nobody in Idaho is eligible for this. So NSG funding requests, that'll be a dollar amount. And then total project cost, perhaps it's more than the federal amount. And so the total cost is asked for here. Many federal grant funds from FEMA and other entities require a cost share or a cost match. NSGP does not. There is no cost share requirement for this grant. And then moving on, any current contract with DHS, yes or no, and ask you to describe it if so. And let's see, this does not include any NSGP funds previously awarded to the nonprofit organization. So pretty straightforward. If yes, please describe what it is. You have another FEMA grant or DHS grant that would be an example, or a cooperative agreement. Investment phase, is this a new or ongoing project? And it's binary, new or ongoing. And by the way, for what we call novice applicants, that is an organization who has never benefited from NSGP prior, there are competitive points. So as a new grantee, I mean, that's one of the incentive pieces for new grantees. If you're a novice, you automatically get additional points. And then moving on to section 2 of the IJ, or investment justification. Little description, symbolic value. I think about things like the Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial. Think about an older building. There's the Boy Scouts is up here in Boise, and I think it's a historic site. And so this is an area to call out the cultural, symbolic, historical significance of the institution. And any part of that may render the site as a target of terrorism. Additionally, describe any previous or existing role in responding to or recovering from terrorist attacks. And moving on to section 3, this is about your vulnerability assessment or risk assessment. And those assessments should call out or highlight what are the threats, vulnerabilities, and potential consequences of an attack. So this is where you'd highlight your vulnerability assessment, threat identification, vulnerability identification, and consequence identification. So pretty straightforward, this section. I'm going to pause to make sure there's no questions lingering. It looks like we're good. Moving on. And section 4 has to do with, based on these three items, A, B, C, what are the threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences? What do you propose to do to mitigate or prevent or decrease the chances of these three things happening? So this is where you just grab your plan. What do you want to do? Equipment, training, exercise, planning. And again, the two sections of the authorized equipment list are called out here. So you describe your plan there in 2,200 characters or less. And if you're interested in equipment, this is where you call out the things you want to purchase. There are current grantees, and in this section, security cameras, lighting, access control, bulletproof film for windows. These are some of the hardening items that were purchased and implemented by some existing grantees. And all you do is look it up on that website that I highlighted. There's an AEL number. It'll give it to you. It'll give you a description. It'll give you the, well, you can identify the vulnerability to be addressed and then the funding requested. So all this should be pretty straightforward and lined out when you look at that authorized equipment list. And the examples I mentioned aren't exhaustive. I'd encourage you to go into that website and take a look at all the items in section 14 and 15, because there may be some innovations you haven't thought of that can help harden the target. And this section 5 is about milestones. What are those major things along the way that will demonstrate progress in terms of the grant activity? What's the milestone? When will it start? When will it end? So that's pretty straightforward. And then what we need is the identification of who is lead on the project. So who's going to manage the project? Because we need a point of contact for reporting, for technical assistance, to learn great practices and share them with other grantees. So who's going to manage the project? And then the project management description. Any anticipated challenges to the effective implementation of the project, and any coordination of the project with state and local homeland security partners. And this really is called out to, again, help with the alignment of local, state, federal. I mean, that's one of the goals of this activity. And you can see how items are weighted. If we go back real quick, this is not weighted at all. There's no score to this, simply information, eligibility information, really. This background, 2 points out of 40. 12 points out of 40 is the vulnerability assessment. But you can see 14 points out of 40 is the plan. That's the most important, your plan and your milestones. And so just notice the weighting here. In project management, again, 3 points. Important, good to call out, but again, identify which is weighted more. And I'd suggest spend most of your attention on those with the biggest points. And then section 7 asks for measurable outputs and outcomes that will indicate the investment is successful at the end of the performance period. In other words, what is the state of affairs at the end of the day when the grant project's done? How will things be different? So this calls out outcomes you anticipate, and this calls out the national preparedness goal and the core capabilities that this investment will work to achieve. So it asks for a little explanation of how this investment support the building or sustaining of these core capabilities. So we'll go to this website and I'll show you the core capabilities, and they're pretty straightforward. And I would imagine any idea you have in mind for your organization will line up with one or more of these. So this is where you'd call out the national goal core capabilities and what your plan will help to support and address. Let's see, funding history. Have you had NSG funding in the past? Yes or no? Again, incentive points for novice grantees. And if you have, it asks for a little more additional information. From my knowledge, there is a total of 3 grantees in Idaho who have benefited from NSGP in the last 3 years, I think. So advanced certification, you click the box. So this is the IGA, or the investment justification. On the workbook, there's an introduction. Any confusion, concern, there's helpful hints in terms of characters. You having trouble with it, the instructions are helpful. So I'm going to stop there, and it sounds like there's a question.
Don wants to know if there are time-sensitive grant milestones.
So the question is, are there time-sensitive grant milestones? Well, the first one is the deadline, which I'll call out. Other than that, I would suggest identify what you want to do with your project, and as long as it's done within those 36 months, make it reasonable and necessary.
Meant once it's awarded.
Oh, what are the milestones once it's awarded? Good question. So once the grant is awarded, an initial milestone will be a kickoff meeting. So successful grantees will gather with me and my team, and we'll walk through some of the requirements and do a celebration, and then get down to business. Beyond that, there are the milestones that are identified by the applicants. An ongoing milestone with any FEMA grant is quarterly reporting. It's not too cumbersome or robust. Entails two things: a financial report, which is pretty straightforward, and then a performance progress report. In the last 3 months, what happened? And those are those quarterly milestones are the biggest thing in place, and then grant closeout at the end. So from the state perspective, it's award, kickoff, quarterly reports, closeout. Other than that, it's the milestones that you as subrecipients or applicants identify.
I have a couple more questions.
Great.
One is, for equipment and building alterations, are bids required to include?
Good question. So there are some assurances that are required for any recipient of FEMA funds. And those requirements include going out to bid for equipment over a certain dollar amount. And we can get more into detail on that in an after call or a frequently asked question conversation. So likely is the answer to that. Plus, it's good practice. I mean, these are our taxpayer dollars, and so stewardship is called for, and bids help us get there. There are state contracts that may be helpful that organizations can purchase off of. Yeah, that would be my short answer to that question. There's a cost threshold beyond which you want to go out to bid for.
Next question is, for equipment, are vehicles on the authorized list?
Ooh, that's a great question. I do not know the answer to that. That's something that can be identified through this list right here, buckets 14 and 15. So if you have questions about vehicles, I think it's unlikely they're in 14 and 15. It's worth a look. Investigate sections 14 and 15. That'd be my recommendation.
Is this an annual grant opportunity?
Is this an annual grant opportunity? There is no sure thing when it comes to grants. However, this has been in play for a number of years, and I know Congress and the White House plussed up the funding for it. I'd be surprised if it wasn't available again next year, same time frame. Okay, no more questions. I'll fast forward. So here is the review process. Subrecipients, interested organizations, submit applications to the SAA, and that again is the Idaho Office of Emergency Management. So from a local nonprofit, grants are not submitted directly to FEMA. They go through the state. So grants come to the email address I'm going to show you. And our role is to verify eligibility, validate the organization type, review and score all complete applications. We rank them by funding priority, and then we submit them to FEMA. So in terms of a timeline, today is our pre-award or bidders workshop for potential applicants. And this is a big one to highlight. The investment justification submission, in addition to the mission statement, the vulnerability assessment, and any supporting documentation, is due to the Idaho Office of Emergency Management, or SAA, by April 21, 5 p.m. close of business, Mountain Standard Time. So that's the deadline. And that's the email to submit your application to. And that gives us a window till May 14th to do our activity and submit our funding priority slate to FEMA. So May 14 is the big hard drop dead for us. So what I did is I moved up the deadline to April 21 to give us some time to get our act together and submit to FEMA our slate of funding priorities. Awards will be announced no later than December of 21, and grant activity can begin September 1 for a period of 36 months. This is the review process. At this point, I'll pause. Here's my contact information. Again, this recording is will be memorialized on our website, and I'll also post this slide deck so you can click on the links and explore the information embedded within the links because it's helpful. So at this time, I'll pause and see if there's any questions that come in. We'll give it a minute. And as we wait for questions to come in, feel free to call or email after the fact. Ladies and gentlemen, I really appreciate your time and attention and interest in learning more about the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. No, this is likely an annual thing, so perhaps this is just a primer and prep for next time around. At any rate, if you have a colleague or a friend or a partner whose organization may benefit that was not aware of this webinar, please share the information, share my number. Idaho has allocated $1.35 million. My interest is not to revert or leave any money on the table back to FEMA. So I would like to capture and leverage all this money to support Idaho organizations and nonprofits as they serve their communities. Thanks to all. With that, we are complete. And
can you say a bit more about what level of coordination with your office or county is available with regards to responding to the questions?
Yeah, that's a good. So the question has to do with coordination around helping populate the questions embedded in the IJ. My office and my team, our job is to provide support, technical assistance, and guidance around what the prompts and the investment justification are asking for. We can't write the answers for you. We can certainly point direction and give you, other examples or other FEMA resources. At a local level, I would suggest reaching out to your county emergency manager or local law enforcement organization, as they may be able to help paint a picture and point you in the right direction. So this may be a great opportunity to, whether you go for this grant or not, or award it or not, a great opportunity to establish and maintain a partnership with your local first responders, because that should be important for all of us. So that's what I would offer on that question. All right, if there are no